He thought he was rescuing the dog. He was wrong. The cage was rusted through at the bottom, the kind of rust that comes not from rain, but from years of no one caring enough to look. It sat at the edge of a gravel lot behind a shuttered feed store on the outskirts of Kenora, Ontario, and if Declan Marsh hadn't taken the long way home that Tuesday, the way he always took when he didn't want to arrive, he never would have seen it. But he did take the long way. He always did. The dog inside was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 18 months old, with mud caked into the fur along her spine and eyes that didn't beg. That was the thing Declan noticed first. Most dogs in a situation like that, cold, abandoned, ribs showing through their coat, would be pressing their nose against the wire, making themselves small and desperate. This one was sitting upright in the center of the cage, watching him the way a soldier watches. A stranger crossed the perimeter, assessing, waiting. Declan stood in the gravel for a long moment, hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket, the October wind off the lake cutting right through it. He was 53 years old. He had spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL and another 6 as a trainer, and he had seen that look before, not in dogs, but in men who had been through something they couldn't name yet. Men sitting in the back of transport planes with their arms on their knees and their eyes on nothing, doing the math on what was left. He broke the lock with a rock from the gravel. It took 3 tries. She didn't run when the door swung open. She stood up slowly, stepped out onto the gravel like she was inspecting the ground first, sniffed the air twice, and then sat down at his left side as if she had been doing it her whole life. Declan looked down at her. She looked up at him. "All right," he said. It was the first word he had spoken out loud in 4 days. He had come to Kenora 8 months earlier, after the funeral, after the 30 days of leave that became 60, that became an honorable discharge he hadn't exactly fought. After the apartment in Halifax he'd given up. After his sister's guest room in Sudbury, where he'd lasted 3 weeks before the tightness in his chest got so constant he drove north just to have something to look at besides walls. His wife, Joanna, had died in February, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end, which was both too fast and somehow also too slow. She was 49. She had been a school librarian and a terrible cook, and she laughed so easily, so readily, at things that weren't even that funny, at her own jokes especially, which were genuinely bad, and Declan had spent 21 years loving that laugh so completely that when it stopped the silence it left was a physical thing, like pressure behind the eyes. He didn't talk about her. He wasn't equipped to. He had a language for logistics and mission parameters and casualty assessments, but he had no language for this, no training for the particular discipline of sitting in a house where another person used to live, and simply continuing to breathe. He rented a small place on the eastern edge of Kenora from a man named Aldous, who ran the marina and didn't ask questions, which Declan respected. The house was 2 bedrooms with brown carpet and a wood stove and a view of a stand of white birch turned gold in October and then dropped everything, which Declan also respected. It was honest. No pretending. He ran every morning, 6 kilometers along the lake road, because the body needed a reason. He ate what he remembered to buy. He slept in 4-hour segments because he always had and probably always would. He didn't call his sister back. He was not doing well. He knew that. He just didn't have a next step yet. The dog needed a vet. That was obvious. The vet was a woman named Dr. Okafor, who ran a small practice off Main Street, and who, when Declan walked in at 4:30 with a malnourished Malinois and no appointment, simply said, "Bring her into room 2 without blinking." Dr. Okafor was in her mid-40s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. She checked the dog over while Declan stood with his arms crossed against the far wall. Dehydrated, underweight, possible mild frostbite on 2 toes. "Nothing permanent," Dr. Okafor said. "How long was she outside?" "I don't know. The lock was rusted. Could have been weeks." Dr. Okafor looked at the dog, who was sitting on the exam table with the same unnerving composure she'd had in the gravel lot. "She's not afraid," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Declan said. "Malinois are working dogs. They go flat without a job. Whatever she went through, she's still got that instinct." She glanced at him over her glasses. "What's her name?" She doesn't have one. What are you going to call her? Declan thought for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the practice window. The dog turned her head and looked at him, waiting. Rue, he said. He didn't know why. It just arrived. Dr. Okafor nodded like it was a reasonable answer and went back to writing her notes. She'll need high-protein food, small amounts 4 times a day for the first week. Bring her back Thursday. And she paused, not looking up. Get her outside. She needs to move. So do I, Declan said, mostly to himself. Dr. Okafor looked up at him then, just briefly. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either, and somehow that was enough. The first morning, Rue followed him on the 6-kilometer run without being asked. She matched his pace exactly. It shouldn't have been impressive given her condition, but it was. She ran like she had been conserving herself for exactly this. When they turned back toward the house, she pulled slightly ahead, glanced back once, and slowed, so he could catch up. Declan noticed that. At home, she didn't settle on the couch or curl in a corner the way he'd expected. She chose a spot 3 feet from the door and sat there, watching, not anxious watching, something more like deliberate watching, like she had taken on a shift and intended to serve it. He started talking to her in the second week. Not much at first, just narrating, the way he'd heard people do with dogs, which had always seemed to him a kind of embarrassing eccentricity. Water bowls over here. I'm going out to get wood. Don't eat the gloves. Functional things. But somewhere in the third week it became less functional. He found himself explaining things to her while he cooked, going on longer than necessary, saying things he hadn't said out loud before. About Joanna. About the last month, the hospital, the specific cruelty of fluorescent hallway light at 2 in the morning, about a mission in 2009 that he still hadn't told anyone about, not his CO, not his therapist in Halifax, not his sister. Small things first, then less small things. Rue listened the way she did everything, with complete, demonstrative attention. She didn't put her head on his knee or whimper sympathetically. She just stayed in the room, present, and waited for him to finish. And he wasn't sure when he started to feel less like he was talking at her, and more like she understood him. He was aware on some level that this was probably not rational. He was also aware on the same level that he had stopped measuring everything by rational. The neighbors were an unexpected complication. Declan's house shared a gravel lane with 3 others, a young couple named Felix and Diane who were winterizing their summer property, a retired schoolteacher named Harriet who had lived on the lane for 30 years, and a man in his 60s named Conrad who kept odd hours and waved from a distance but had never in 8 months come any closer. It was Rue who changed this. It started with Harriet. She appeared at the edge of the lane one morning while they were coming back from the run, announced that she had made too much apple cake and would be ashamed to waste it, and handed Declan a tin without waiting for him to agree. She crouched down to Rue's level. Rue sniffed her hand, and then, for the first time since Declan had found her, made a sound. Not a bark. Something quieter, lower. A sound like acknowledgement. Harriet looked up at Declan with bright eyes. She's talking, she said. She does that sometimes, Declan said, though in fact she never had before. Harriet started bringing things. Not always cake, sometimes soup, sometimes a bag of apples from the tree in her backyard, once a folded flannel blanket she said she didn't need anymore. Declan accepted these deliveries with an awkwardness that she gracefully ignored. He understood, eventually, that the food was not really the point. Harriet had been a widow for 6 years, and she knew things about silence, and she knew things about what it cost, and she was offering him a doorway without making it obvious that she knew he needed one. Felix and Diane were different, younger, louder, full of the busy confidence of people in their early 30s who believed that problems were mostly logistics. But they had a genuine and uncomplicated love for dogs, and Rue had decided, for reasons of her own, that she liked them, and she would trot over to the fence when she heard their truck in the lane and wait there, ears up, until Felix came over to scratch behind her ears and deliver his daily status report on whatever they were building that day. It was Felix who told Declan, matter-of-factly one afternoon, that Conrad had a daughter in Thunder Bay who didn't visit. "I don't know the story," Felix said, "but he's been out here alone a long time." Declan didn't say anything. but he started waving back properly instead of just nodding. And one evening in late November, when the temperature dropped hard and fast, and he saw that Conrad's woodpile was low, he stacked half of his own supply on the man's porch and left before the door could open. Conrad knocked on his door the next morning with a bottle of rye whiskey, and the look of a man who had decided to step across something. They sat at Declan's kitchen table for 2 hours. Rue lay between their chairs. They didn't talk about much. Hockey, the marina, the winter coming fast. But somewhere in the second hour, Conrad mentioned a son he'd lost 4 years back, and Declan mentioned Joanna, and they sat with that for a while without either of them trying to fix it. When Conrad left, Declan realized he felt lighter. Not repaired, not solved, but lighter, the way you feel when you put down something you've been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. December brought snow that was serious and meant it, the kind that came off Lake of the Woods sideways and piled against the doors and demanded to be taken seriously. Rue loved it. She was a different animal in snow. Faster, almost playful in the way she moved through it, kicking up sprays with her front paws like she was testing it. Declan watched her sometimes from the window before he went out and felt something move in him that it took him a while to name. It was close to joy, at the edge of it. Close enough that he could feel the shape of it, which he hadn't been able to do in a long time. She had started doing something he couldn't explain rationally, so he stopped trying to. Every morning, at the same time, she would go to the bedroom door. The door to the room where Joanna's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand because Declan hadn't been able to move them, and she would stand there for a moment, very still, and then go back to her spot. Not barking, not scratching, just standing, like she was keeping a kind of vigil. He didn't know what she knew. He didn't think it was his job to figure out. What he knew was this: she got him out of the house in weather he would otherwise have used as an excuse. She gave him something to come home to. She had, in the quiet and unsentimental way of working dogs, assigned him a purpose, to take care of her, to show up, to keep moving, and she held him to it without asking anything he couldn't give. He called his sister on a Thursday in the second week of December. He didn't plan it. He was standing in the kitchen after feeding Rue, and his phone was already in his hand, and it was either call or not call, and he chose. His sister, whose name was Pamela, and who had been waiting with a patience Declan had not earned, answered on the second ring and said nothing except his name, and then waited for him to start. He told her about Kenora, about the lane and the neighbours and the birch trees. He told her about Harriet and the apple cake and Conrad and the whiskey. He told her about Rue. Found her in a rusted cage, he said, by the old feed store, and Pamela was quiet for a moment and then said, "That sounds like you," which Declan understood to mean that she wasn't talking about the dog. He didn't tell her everything, but he told her enough that she stopped holding her breath, which was the part that mattered. January, a man drove down the lane in a truck with Alberta plates and knocked on Aldous' door looking for whoever had the dog. Word had gotten back somehow. Small towns move information the way water moves through limestone, slowly and completely. That there was a Belgian Malinois living on the east side, and that someone might be owed an explanation. The man's name was Dale, and he had the look of someone hoping the problem would resolve itself before he had to deal with it. He explained, hat in hand, that the dog had belonged to his brother, who had moved away and left her, and was now in Saskatchewan, and wasn't coming back for her. He said this with the particular brevity of someone who knows the sentence reflects badly on another person and doesn't want to linger on it. Declan stood in the lane with Rue at his left side. He looked at Dale. He looked at Rue. Rue was looking at Dale the way she looked at everything, without fear, without aggression, with a measured assessment of a dog who had already decided the important thing and was simply waiting for the humans to catch up. "Is there a legal claim?" Declan asked. Dale thought about this longer than it should have required. "No," he said finally. "There's not." Declan nodded once. "All right then." Dale nodded back, looking almost relieved, and got back in his truck and drove away. Rue watched the truck until it turned off the lane. Then she turned and walked back to the house and sat down by the door. That was the end of it. February arrived, and with it the anniversary of the day Joanna died. Declan had been watching it approach on the calendar, the way you watch weather moving in off the lake. Knowing it's coming, knowing there's nothing to do about it, knowing it will be what it's going to be. He woke early and ran longer than usual. When he came back, Harriet had left something on his step. A small jar of the honey from her sister's farm in the Interlake, with a card that said, "Only thinking of you today." He didn't know how she knew. He suspected she had counted from the few things he'd told her, the way people who have been through grief themselves develop a kind of arithmetic for it. He spent most of the morning sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, which was something Joanna had always gently mocked him. "For you start with such good intentions," she used to say, looking at the mug. He could hear her voice, clearly, the exact cadence of it, which he both needed and could barely stand. Rue came and sat beside his chair. She put her chin on his knee, the first time she had ever done this, and kept it there. Declan put his hand on her head. He sat there for a long time with the cold coffee and the sound of February wind and his hand on the dog's head, and he cried in the way men who have spent decades not crying eventually do, badly, without grace, for longer than expected. Rue didn't move. She just stayed. It was done. He washed his face and made fresh coffee and stood at the window looking out at the birch trees, which were bare and white against the gray sky, and looked, in that light, like something that had already survived the worst and was simply waiting for spring. He thought about what Dr. Okafor had said that first day. Get her outside. She needs to move. He'd thought at the time that she was only talking about the dog. By March, the ice on the lake was beginning to soften at the edges, and the light was coming back in that way it does in northern Ontario. Gradually, and then all at once, like a door opening. Rue had filled out completely. The coat was thick and clean, her eyes clear. She ran with him every morning and worked the property in the afternoons, and had developed, over the winter, a particular habit of bringing him things. Not chewing them, just carrying them to where he was sitting. His work gloves, a pine cone from the yard. Once the paperback he'd left on the porch chair. She would set these things down at his feet and look at him, and he was never entirely sure whether she was bringing him gifts or assigning him tasks. He had started calling Dr. Okafor's office on reasons that were increasingly thin. An update on Rue's toe. A question about dietary supplements he could have answered with a search. A report on the running progress that Dr. Okafor absorbed with professional patience, and something that might have been amusement. She had, in the months since October, become a kind of anchor for him. Not romantic, nothing so complicated as that, just the presence of a person who had seen him at his most disorganized and continued to be interested in how he was doing. He valued that in a way he hadn't expected to. March, she asked, directly at the end of a call, whether he had looked into the veteran support group that met in Kenora on Tuesday evenings at the curling club. He hadn't. He told her he hadn't. She said she thought he might find it useful and then didn't push it, which was the right instinct. He went in April. He sat in the back. He didn't say much the first time or the second, but the third Tuesday he mentioned Joanna and a man across the room. A former combat engineer named Brent, who had the specific stillness of someone who had also learned not to fill silence unnecessarily, just nodded, and the nod was enough. Declan started going every week. May, his niece, came up from Sudbury, Pamela's daughter, who was 24 and studying environmental science, and had her mother's directness and her own considerable stubbornness, and she stayed for a long weekend and hiked the trails with Declan and Rue, and did not, even once, ask him how he was doing in the careful, watching way that people had been asking him for over a year. She just asked him things. What was that bird? And whether he thought the lake would be warm enough to swim by July. Whether Rue preferred the trail through the pines or the one along the water. She was, without announcing it, treating him like a person again, and this turned out to be exactly what he needed. On her last morning, she took a photograph on her phone of Declan and Rue at the end of the dock, the morning light coming sideways across the lake, Rue sitting at his left side where she always was, Declan's hand resting on her head. His niece texted it to him that evening and said simply, "You both look better." He looked at the photograph for a long time. He didn't know what he looked like, exactly. He couldn't see himself clearly enough for that. But he thought he saw what his niece meant. Something in his posture, in the angle of his shoulders, that was different from the man who had walked into Dr. Okafor's clinic 8 months earlier holding a dog with no name. Joanna would have loved Rue. That was something he had known for a while, but only recently let himself think about without the thought coming with grief attached. Joanna had always wanted a dog. He had been the one who said not yet, always not yet, because of the deployments and the schedule, and the particular kind of selfishness that comes from believing there is always more time. She had been right about the dog. She had been right about a lot of things he intended to spend the rest of his life trying to understand. He still hadn't moved her reading glasses. He wasn't sure he was going to. But he had recently started reading again himself, a thing he hadn't done since the diagnosis, since the world had narrowed to the geography of hospital corridors and parking garages and the particular plastic smell of palliative care. He read at the kitchen table in the evenings, with Rue in her spot and the wood stove going, and the lake making its long, patient sounds outside. And he read until his coffee went cold, which Joanna would have found predictable and satisfying. He was not fixed. He was not whole in the way he used to be, and he was not sure he was supposed to be. The men at the Tuesday group would have recognized the distinction. Some things don't heal in the way a fracture heals, clean, with a line you can point to on an X-ray. Some things just become part of how you're built, and you carry them differently as time goes on, until eventually the carrying is something you do without thinking, like breathing, like the 6 kilometers along the lake road every morning with the Belgian Malinois running at your left side as if she had been doing it her whole life. Maybe she had been. In some direction Declan didn't fully understand. Maybe she always had been. What he knew. What he could say with the clean certainty he'd once reserved for coordinates and weather windows and the weight of gear, was that on a Tuesday in October, on a gravel lot behind a shuttered feed store in Kenora, Ontario, a rusted lock and a heavy rock, and the long way home had brought him to a dog who needed him or who needed something, and that he had broken the lock and carried her home thinking he was the one doing the rescuing. He had been wrong about that. It was the best mistake he'd ever made.